From KCRW in Santa Monica and PRI, Public Radio International, this is To the Point.
Iran's nuclear program, once again, it's down to the wire. Hello again, I'm Armin Alney, and this is To the Point from Public Radio International, a daily look at the issues Americans care about most. There's only a week remaining for talks to continue a one-year limit on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relaxing crippling economic sanctions. Russia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Western Europe all have major stakes in the outcome, which could reshape the political contours of the Middle East. President Obama and Iran's President Rouhani both want an agreement, but Republicans could pass new sanctions or the supreme leader could kill any deal. We'll hear about possible benefits, potential risks, and political consequences. We're only back with To the Point, talking once again about the extension of talks, the termination date for talks on Iran's nuclear program, scheduled for next Monday after a year-long hiatus during which some economic sanctions were released and during which Iran did, in fact, drastically reduce or significantly reduce its nuclear program. Imad Kiai is executive director at the American Iranian Council. That's a bipartisan think tank advocating closer ties between the U.S. and Iran. He's also a researcher at Princeton University. He focuses there on Iran and nuclear nonproliferation. Imad Kiai, thanks very much for being on our program.
Thank you so much for having me.
We heard at the very end of the first part of our program that there are many other issues that could have an impact on the nuclear talks or that could be impacted by the nuclear talk. Let's talk first about ISIS.
Definitely. I mean, the fight against ISIS has now jumped up on the Washington's foreign policy issue as number one for the region of the Middle East, both for security and stability in Iraq and Syria, but also to stem the rise of extremism in the region. And here it's quite important to then tie back the issue of the fight against ISIS to the role Iran can play, and most constructive role it can play in this fight. But for U.S. and Iran to engage against the fight against ISIS, there needs to be a resolution on the nuclear front that opens up the gate for cooperations on issues of mutual interest, one being ISIS.
Why is Iran interested in, or would it be interested in cooperating with the United States with regard to ISIS?
It's threefold. First of all, for Iran, the stability of Iraq is paramount to its own security. And therefore, this comes eye to eye to Washington's concerns over the security of Baghdad. So here, they have a mutual interest to work together to stabilize Iraq. Number two, the Takfiri or Salafist movement ideology that underpins ISIS and its rise in the region, it's a Sunni extremist group. And this ideologically goes against the trend of Shia Iran, who sees these Takfiris and Salafist ISIS fighters as sort of the paramount threat to Shia security and population throughout Iraq and Syria. And finally, Iran also wants to see Syria stabilized. And while here there has been a historical disparity between Washington and Tehran's views on the Assad government, I think today, with the rise of ISIS and extremism that is unleashed on Syria, there's closer and closer sort of movement towards finding a middle ground where you can have Syria stabilized and ISIS defeated there as well. And here again, Iran and the U.S. need to work together for this fight. Finally, Warren, it's very important to also acknowledge that the current coalition that the U.S. has gathered against ISIS, its composition is nations in the region who have previously, or till very recently, have supplied, armed, financed groups such as ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and Iraq. Therefore, if we want a true partner that has shown over and over again its seriousness in fighting extremism, specifically in Syria and Iraq, I think Iran is basically the main player that can really have tangible changes as against the fight against ISIS.
Imad Kiai, again, Executive Director of the American Iranian Council. Reuel Marc Gerecht is a former CIA Iranian Targets Officer. He was Senior Fellow at the Foundation. He's now Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. That's a conservative think tank focusing on foreign policy and national security. Familiar voice on our program. Good to have you back.
Pleasure.
Do those three issues just listed, Iraq stability, the ideology issue of Sunnis versus Shias, and the Syrian stabilization question, make it worthwhile for the United States to look toward Iran rather than, for example, or perhaps in addition to Saudi Arabia, as an ally against ISIS?
I don't really think so. I mean, there's no question that the President of the United States has tried to extend an olive branch to the Iranian regime, not only over this issue, but just in general. The Iranians have had a great deal to do with fanning sectarian hatred in the region. That's certainly the case in Iraq. It's the case in Syria with the Assad regime. So, and it's by no means clear that the Iranians, for example, are really that upset by what has transpired in Iraq. I think they were a bit surprised to see ISIS develop, but at the same time, it has created much firmer links between the Iraqis and the Iranians. The Iraqi Shia have a mixed history with the Iranians, and certainly when the Iraqi Shia are in trouble, they tend to look towards, their uncle in Iran, and a lot of things are overlooked. A lot of bad blood is overlooked. So I think the situation actually is pretty good for Iran. I don't see how the nuclear negotiations, they certainly would try to use ISIS. You can look at Foreign Minister Zarif's commentary. He would like to use, I think, ISIS as a tool to get the Americans and the French in particular to diminish their positions, to become, quote, more flexible. But I suspect it's not going to work. I think they're going to deal with the nuclear issue on its own merits.
What about what we heard earlier from Thomas Erdebrink, the Tehran bureau chief for the New York Times, that Iran over the years has moved from a nation that is ideological to a middle class society, even though, of course, the hardline elements are still there and still have the ability to exercise some control. Does that make you think, Reuel Marc Gerecht, that there might be openings that weren't there before?
No. I mean, I think I wouldn't describe them as elements. I would never describe the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guard Corps and hardcore members of clergy as elements. I would describe them as the regime. And I think, the defining moment for the Supreme Leader, I think, was in 1965, where he translated Sayyid Qutb's "The future belongs to this religion." I mean, one does not translate Sayyid Qutb, haphazardly. It has defined the Supreme Leader. If you look at his speeches, I see no diminishment, just the opposite, actually. I mean, as these negotiations have been going on, the Supreme Leader has talked ever more powerfully about the idea of Iran developing an autarkic economy. The Revolutionary Guard Corps has been adamant in its wish to see the nuclear program maintained. And even when it comes to someone like President Rouhani, he is one of the founding fathers of the nuclear program. I mean, he and his probably his most famous mentor, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, were really the driving forces behind the program getting going in the first place. So I don't think the middle class in Iran, and the middle class has been there since the revolution, by the way, and certainly its dissatisfaction with theocracy has grown. The explosions in 2009 were evident of that. The eruptions that occur about every 10 years let you know that the Iranian middle class, particularly the urban, more secularized folks, would like a different type of society, but they don't hold the power.
Imad Kiai, back to you at the American-Iranian Council. What we're hearing is a traditional way for the United States since the Iranian Revolution to look at Iran. Is it in any way, do you think, inadequate? Do you see that there are openings, that there have been changes that might, in fact, lead to a better relationship?
Well, Warren, first of all, the history of U.S.-Iran relations for the past 3.5 decades has been marred by misunderstandings, miscommunication. And of course, there's a list of issues on both sides that, we can target and talk about like the discussion has been going on for years. Yet there is an opening, there is a change, and we should not be naive to think that, this opportunity that we have right now is not an opening for future better relations between two countries. No longer can U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, while the region is burning, from Syria to Iraq to Libya to North Africa to the right extremism, terrorism, and instability, requires a changing in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And most importantly, the one regional player in the region that can actually put its weight towards something more constructive is Iran. Now, yes, there are issues, and what I'm saying is that the nuclear dossier and the nuclear file that has been negotiated for the past decade, if it's concluded, and if there is a mechanism and a framework to move forward to make sure Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful, that Iran adheres to the maximum level of transparency, verification that is available under international regulations, then I believe once the nuclear issue is off the table, U.S. and Iran, that for the first time in the past year have started discussing bilaterally at ministerial level, both Secretary of State John Kerry and his counterpart Dr. Zarif have now had face-to-face talk. This is the first time in 35 years. And I think the more discussions are happening between the two countries at that level, I think it provides the space for confidence building, for trust building, and for mechanisms to be put in place where we can have both countries cooperate on areas that are of mutual interest.
Well, let me go back to Reuel, Marc, Gerecht on these issues. Certainly the region is burning, no question about that, and there are these talks going on. I take it that doesn't give you any reason to be optimistic about it.
No, I'd say just the opposite. I think the Iranians actually think that they have the high ground here. There's no question that the sanctions have hurt and that parts of the ruling establishment want to see those sanctions diminish. They want to see how best they can orchestrate these negotiations to get them lessened. I think Rouhani in particular, who backed off the nuclear program or wanted to back off to the nuclear program after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, was willing to accept a pause, to retreat sort of to go forward. It's by no means clear the Supreme Leader agrees with that now. He didn't agree with it back in 2003 to 2005. So I think the chances of that are quite small. I think the only way that you're going to have an agreement, a permanent agreement, is if the Americans and the French make a lot more concessions. I think it's not unlikely that you'll have some type of parameters agreement by the 24th of November, which would allow or justify another extension. But I think the hard facts of this are very hard to get around. And I don't think the surrounding trouble really makes that much difference, first and foremost because President Obama has wanted to withdraw from the Middle East. He doesn't want to get more involved with it. I think the troubles there actually encourage his unwillingness to commit more American resources to the region. I think he's done so very reluctantly in Iraq. I think he may continue to have to contribute more, but I don't think during his presidency you're going to see the United States.
Well, he doesn't want military involvement in the
right,
the
and I don't think you're going to see any solution to ISIS unless it is military. So I'm skeptical that either in Iraq or in Syria that you're going to see a significant shift in American policy before the end of Mr. Obama's presidency. It's possible if something really terrible were to happen, but I'm doubtful.
Iman Kiai, back to you. Do you believe as well that ISIS can only be defeated militarily?
No, I believe a military component is necessary, but again, we have to understand ISIS as an ideological group. If we want to bomb ISIS to destruction, it will never happen. We need three-prong approach. One is, yes, airstrikes and coalition forces on the ground, maybe including the Iranians, to fight ISIS. That's one approach. The second one is to go to the root of the matter. How did ISIS rise? How did ISIS expand? Today's ISIS, tomorrow will be something else. Before ISIS was Al-Qaeda. We have to go to the root of the matter, and that's ideological. Ideological in the sense that within Islam, there is an extreme element called Takfiris and Salafists. Those are rooted within one of the main U.S. allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, who has propagated this ideology throughout the region and abroad. So secondly, we have to then have an intra-religious dialogue within Islam that addresses how did this extremist element rise up. Thirdly, we have to address the socioeconomic conditions that are completely changing in the region. As Thomas mentioned, in Iran we have a rising middle class and also a very vibrant youth. It's the same across the region. But for us to be able to manifest the energies of these youth in the region, we have to provide economic and social opportunities that removes this sort of tendency and attraction to...
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you in the interest of time. Reuel, Marc, Gerecht, I'm just interested in your response to all of that. We just have a minute or so left, but that suggests a wholesale change in America's attitude and even alliances in the Middle East. Do you think that's necessary?
Well, I mean, I think sort of reviewing our relationship with the Saudis is certainly a good idea, but I would just note, I mean, the founding father of modern Takfirism is in fact Sayyid Qutb. That is the man who changed Ali Khamenei's, the supreme leader's, intellectual life. It's a mistake to believe that Takfirism only exists on the Sunni side. Radicalism is quite as present on the Shiite side, though it has theocracy in Iran has certainly diminished its appeal for the Iranian people. So I would just be very, very careful of assuming that Shiism somehow means moderation, and that the Sunniism is just extremism.
Okay, we've gotten a long way from the nuclear talks, but once again, all of this is involved and part of the massive equation or combination of equations in the Middle East. And again, the talks are beginning again tomorrow. The deadline is Monday. We'll see if there is, in fact, another extension or if some sort of framework can be worked out. Reuel, Marc, Gerecht again at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks to you. Iman Kiai at the American Iranian Council. And our earlier guests, Thomas Erdebrank, Tehran Bureau Chief for the New York Times, and Laura Rosen with AllMonitor.com.